It is a great honor and a privilege to be asked to appear before this committee, and my attendance at this forum is calculated to show the Zimbabwean people that we take these processes seriously. At the ZEC, we take seriously the rights of all Zimbabweans, the rights of all Zimbabweans who are registered to vote, and our basic policy outlook is that we interpret and apply the law as it currently stands. And that our mandate in terms of the Constitution is that where there are gaps in the law, we are required to make recommendations to the executive for changes in the law. But please, it should be noted that we ourselves do not have the mandate to actually change the laws, which is why I have attended here in my capacity as the ZEC to show that we take these processes seriously that are being done here today, because these are the consultative processes which will result in changes in the law. The first petitioner addressed the question of the disenfranchisement of, according to their statistics, about 2 million persons with disabilities. This is a great cause for concern for us because, firstly, as has become apparent, that figure of statistics is a figure of statistics which is not based on any sort of verification process. I'm not disputing that the figure is 2 million, but I have taken note of the fact that it is necessary and required that those statistics be verified and disseminated to members of the public. The first contention was the non-availability of election material in accessible format. Before I answer the questions, I think it's actually necessary to emphasize that when I say that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission follows the law, I'm looking here at section 22, subsection 1 of the Constitution, and it says the state and all institutions and agencies of government at every level must recognize the rights of persons with physical and mental disabilities. Section 22, subsection 3 goes on to say the state must consider specific requirements of all forms of persons with all forms of disability and encourage the use and development of forms of communication. Now, the operative word for our purposes at ZEC is the state and all institutions of government. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is not the state. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is not an institution of government or an agency of government. It is an independent commission. And what that basically informs us is that the primary responsibility for bringing these things about, which are in the Constitution, lies with the state. So we're basically talking about funding. I'd like also to point to section 155, subsection 2 of the Constitution, which again says the state must take all appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to ensure that effect is given to ensure that all eligible voters, that is to say, citizens qualified under the 4th schedule, are registered as voters. Again, the primary responsibility of ensuring the registration of all eligible voters lies with the state. How does that translate in practice? It translates into practice in that, according to our interpretation of the Constitution and the Electoral Act and all its attendant amendments and regulations, our interpretation of a person who is eligible to vote in terms of the 4th schedule is a person who satisfies the voting requirements which are set out in the schedule. Part of those voting requirements include that one must have an address here in Zimbabwe. And according to our interpretation, that effectively eliminates the registration and or voting of anyone outside Zimbabwe, whether they're in the region or whether they're in the international diaspora, until such time as those regulations pertaining to proof of address and residence are addressed. Those regulations can be changed, but again, that is not ZEC's mandate, it is the mandate of Parliament. So basically, we are informed by the law. I will now attend to answering the issues that have been raised. I just want to stress at the outset that ZEC is not trying to wriggle out of its mandate to conduct free and fair and credible elections. But this gathering must take note of the fact that all those processes, the primary responsibility for funding those processes lies with the government. Now, we appreciate all the efforts that have been made by government and by Treasury to avail the funds. But if you take note, the ZEC had submitted a budget of about 148 million to fund the elections. Of that budget, Treasury has committed itself to giving the ZEC 98 million. there's a budget deficit. ZEC can only do that which it is possible to do within the limited funds that it has. Regarding the non-accessibility of polling stations, the narrow doors, the ablution facilities at the ZEC, we are committed to doing everything possible to ensure that all our registered voters exercise their right to vote in a manner which is stipulated in the Constitution, but again, all our administrative functions are funded by government. If we have the funds in place, there's no reason why these things should not be taken care of. With regards to the use of hate language, I'm pleased to note that political parties, as has been reported by one member of the political parties, are in the final stages of a code of conduct which will govern their conduct as political parties themselves. The reason why the code of conduct is mandated to govern political parties, it is really not the mandate of ZEC alone to disseminate certain information to members of the public. Political parties themselves are bound to disseminate this message to their own members: no to hate speech, no to violence. And we're quite pleased at ZEC to note that the code of conduct, which was already in place, has been revised by the political parties themselves, and that it will soon be made part of our law. With regards to the question why people with disabilities are not represented within the ZEC Commission, my response to that is the appointment of commissioners to the ZEC is entirely within the discretion of the President. That means that any interventions around changing the composition of the Commission is something that will have to be lobbied to the appropriate authority. With regards to the question of accessibility, I'm happy to report that there is a proposed electoral amendment bill which will go through a second reading in Parliament, if I'm not mistaken, in the first week of March. Part of the proposals in that amendment bill is a proposal to allow people with disabilities to be assisted by a person of their choice. This is in recognition of the fact that it was not desirable to have these voters assisted by election officers. So there's a proposed amendment, and members of Parliament should take note of that when the bill is read and debated in Parliament, to ensure that those proposals go through in order to address some of the issues which have been raised. I think that answers the fifth question of assisted voters. The second petitioner, I would like that petitioner to know that according to our preliminary statistics after the BVR registration blitz, about 60% of our registered voters are aged between 18 to 40. To us, that means that this election is an election for young people. And trying to see which questions require answers from me. With regards to media monitoring, what I would like to tell this gathering is that there are committees which are set up in terms of the Constitution and the Electoral Act and its amendments and attendant regulations. These committees actually only kick in once the election date has been proclaimed by the President. In these committees, they regulate media monitoring, accreditation of observers. Now, we are in the pre-election period. Once the election date is proclaimed, we then enter the actual election period. And according to the Constitution and the Electoral Act and its regulations, it is only during the electoral period when these committees kick in that ZEC is now mandated to look at sharing of media space, is now mandated to look into accrediting observers. If the generality of Zimbabweans feel that those processes of monitoring should take place before the proclamation of the election date, the correct action to take is to lobby Parliament to change those regulations to the Electoral Act, which stipulate that these committees kick in once the election date has been proclaimed. The third petitioner accused or charged the ZEC with not clearly disseminating information regarding registration of people with disabilities, and I think I did a quick intervention around that and advised this gathering that we are in the process of cleaning up that data. You might be aware that during the registration exercise, a potential voter could register anyway. But having registered anyway, each voter was then allocated a specific polling station from where they're supposed to register. So at the moment, we're actually in the process of ensuring that everyone has been allocated the correct polling station, ensuring that everybody's names are spelled correctly. And once that process has been done, because after the cleaning up of the data, we still need to do what is called deduplication, which is using fingerprints to weed out double registrants. Now, the credibility of this voters' roll is going to hinge on the authenticity of that process and our production of a provisional voters' roll. We will not hurry that process, not for anybody, because we need to produce a credible voters' roll. Remember, there were perceptions, I want to say, around the old voters' roll. We have started a new process where we had Zimbabweans walking up to a BVR machine and being registered to vote. We need to clean up that data. We need to weed out double registrants, and that process takes time. So you will not be getting those statistics in the next 2 weeks, but perhaps after a month or 6 weeks when we finish the processes. The setting up of Ramsat polling stations, I believe I've already answered that question. And I will now move on to the fourth petition. It is unfortunate that the person who moved this petition is not in the House, but what I will do, the first contention was that the ZEC independence should be guaranteed and that ZEC be given powers to initiate legislation. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is an independent body, and I would, off the cuff, be reluctant to have this commission duplicate something which is already being done by Parliament. It goes to the separation of powers. We as ZEC at the moment are mandated to make recommendations to the executive through the Minister of Justice if we feel that there's any need to change legislation. We would like to keep it that way because it separates us from the executive, and also it allows us to retain our independence. The minute we start moving certain legislation which is perceived as being in support of a certain party, it will compromise our independence. This is my off-the-cuff view. With regards to demilitarization, or the perception that ZEC has a lot of military personnel in its ranks, one of the first things that I did in my first 10 days in office was to call for a list of all the ZEC permanent employees, which constitute about 383, and to look through this list and to see how many people amongst those permanent employees had a former military background. And I can safely and conclusively say the first thing is that the ZEC policy is that we are not precluded from recruiting members of the former members of the security sector, provided that they are retired and not active. Yes, they are in the ZEC, and I will hasten to add that a lot of those former military personnel retired from their institutions and joined ZEC 5, 6, 7 years ago. We have not had any recent recruitment of military, former military or security sector personnel, for the simple reason that there's been a treasury freeze on recruitments, which has been operational in the last 5 years or so. So whoever we have as a permanent employee of ZEC joined ZEC 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago before the treasury freeze. And I have gone through their names and satisfied myself that in their files, these are no longer serving members. Now, unless and until the law changes to inform the ZEC that we are not at liberty to recruit retired members of security sector, we will maintain the position that those who are already in our ranks will perhaps, at least for this election, remain in place until we are informed otherwise. I've been asked that the ZEC must ask the current commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces to undo certain things. I want to say that it is a policy at the ZEC that we engage anyone and everyone who is deemed a stakeholder in the process of going into elections. I do not want to rule out a stakeholder in engagement with the current Zimbabwe Defence Forces commander, although I'm not quite sure what the sanction would be. Or I'm not quite sure whether we can ask the current commander to undo what a previous commander has done, but certainly we're not categorically opposed to any engagements that will assist the political environment going into the elections to be free. The access to the server, being asked whether ZEC will give reasonable access to the server, I think there's need for continuing engagement around this issue. I'm not quite sure what reasonable access would mean, and I'm not quite sure at what stage it is proposed that the access be granted to the server. I'm not quite sure what Honorable Monzora meant when he said, was the server empty when information started being collated into it? He's not here to clarify that. So what I basically want to say around that issue is that certainly we will have continuing stakeholder engagements around that issue. We at the ZEC are committed to transparency, although we really need very specific information as to what exactly it is. What I can say is at ZEC we're guided by the law, and what the law tells us at the moment is that when we finish collating, cleaning up the data, we must produce what is called a provisional voters roll. That provisional voters roll must lie open for inspection for a period of 14 to 21 days by law. It is during that inspection period that is mandated by the law when anyone and everyone is at liberty to come in and say to the ZEC, look, we want to interrogate your processes, we don't like what you've produced provisionally, there are these errors, those errors, and the law actually allows the ZEC to correct those errors before producing a final voters roll, which is then gazetted, whereafter the election date is proclaimed. So certainly, if we're guided by the law to say the provisional voters roll is subject to inspection, subject to representation, subject to correction, there's no reason why that cannot be done at that stage. The need for independent auditing of the voters roll, again, the answer is the same. During the period when the provisional voters roll lies open for inspection, we fully expect all political parties to come in at that process and interrogate our product. The demand for serial numbers and intimidation around serial numbers. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has gone on record to condemn any forms of political violence in any infractions of the Electoral Act and regulations. I want to say something, and I want to be understood clearly. The issue around demand of serial numbers is not an issue which, according to our investigations, we can find one political party guilty of. Our investigations have revealed that this is a practice which started with all political parties asking their members to say, during the period when they were trying to get people to come and register to vote, if you register to vote, come back to our party political headquarters, let us see your serial number so that we can collate our own records so that we know how many of our members have registered to vote. This is how the practice started. The practice also started with chiefs, councillors, headmen, all those people who were mandated to assist people in the rural areas without addresses. Remember, as part of that voter registration processes, they would take certain members of their communities to the BVR center and vouch for them to say, this, we are not ndini chief ningi ndauya naye kuti register vote. So these chiefs, when we were interrogating the processes, at some point in time, because they had villagers, some of them became double registrants, triple registrants, because of incentives that were being offered by political parties in the process. They would then say to them, let me see your BVR registration slip. This is where this practice started. Now, the only infraction around that practice would be intimidation or dissemination of false information. And what we at ZEC have said, the first thing that Zimbabwean people need to know is that you do not need that serial number. You do not need that registration slip in order to vote on voting day. What you simply need is to present yourself with your national identity card and or a valid passport. No one will be able to tell who you have voted for using that serial number. No one will be able to tell what you do in the ballot box using that serial number. So what I want to say is, as Zimbabweans, it is our collective responsibility. This is our election. This is our country. It's not a ZEC election. It is an election for Zimbabwean people to choose their leaders in a responsible manner. We are all responsible for assisting each other, political parties, all other stakeholders alike, to bring about a conducive electoral environment. We have condemned this practice around serial numbers. We have conducted voter education around it. And we've been asked a question whether or not as ZEC we can outlaw the BVR slip. The BVR slip is merely a record that shows that you registered to vote. It then becomes redundant in any subsequent voting processes that take place after that. You really don't need it. So you should disseminate that information if your political parties to your members so that they are advised and not misinformed. Free access to the media committee which regulates that kicks in after the election date has been proclaimed by the president. We are in the pre-election phase. It hasn't kicked in yet. When it does, ZEC has a very specific mandate and role about ensuring that political space is shared equally in the media by all political parties in terms of the regulations around this committee, which are very much in place and which are very specific to say what should happen in the state broadcasting media, what should happen in the print media, what should happen even on the radio about sharing space. But please be advised, these committees only kick in after the election date has been proclaimed. So it's not as if we don't have regulations in place. It's not as if the law doesn't inform us what we should do. The law stipulates that this should be done only after a certain date. The diaspora vote, I believe I did my best to explain the diaspora vote, except I was corrected to say there's nothing in the Constitution, but the Constitution gives birth to the Electoral Act, which gives birth to the regulations which all govern this process. Interaction between ZEC and political parties, there's again certain committees which kick in when the election date has been proclaimed, and these committees, in our view at ZEC, they are adequate to bring about interaction. We've also had at district and provincial level interaction between the ZEC and political parties, and interaction between ZEC, political parties, and our other stakeholders, such as the police and the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. The printing of ballot papers, whether or not the opposition must be present, we are open to any suggestions which can be discussed at whatever intervention levels that we have. The quality of the ballot paper, quite obviously, the ZEC is guided by regulations which stipulate that. The repeal of obnoxious laws, again, that is a matter for Parliament to take into account. ZEC has already discharged its mandate and made recommendations around those pieces of legislation through the Ministry of Justice to Parliament, and we expect that our recommendations will be taken into account. I don't know what Honorable Monzora meant by timeous release of the voters' roll. As I've said, I've explained the process. After cleaning, we do deduplication. We produce a provisional voters' roll which lies open for inspection. We do corrections, then we produce a final voters' roll which is gazetted. The Electoral Court, the impression given was that it is unconstitutional for judges to be sitting both as judges of the Electoral Court and the High Court. The simple answer to that question is that the Electoral Court is a mere division of the High Court. So there's no question of conflict of interest. There's no question of judges having two mandates. It's simply a division of the High Court, and judges are merely appointed to the Electoral Court during that electoral period. So there's no conflict there. The Accreditation Committee, which will consider whether or not the AU, the UN, SADC, and any other members who wish to observe our elections, that accreditation committee, like all other committees around the electoral process, will kick in once the president proclaims the election date. Prior to that proclamation, we are in the pre-election period, and the law only allows those committees to kick in after that date. Again, if Zimbabweans are unhappy with the date at which those committees kick in, they are at liberty to lobby Parliament to change the law. The final thing that I want to say through you, Mr. Chair, I'm aware that I've talked for quite a bit and everyone else is quiet. I would like, in my capacity as the chairman of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, to implore all political parties, all CSOs, all our stakeholders to cascade the message down to our voters. We need that message to go out: zero tolerance to violence, no hate speech. We must encourage the electorate to talk about policies, to challenge those who wish to be elected to talk about policies. We must stop violence and hate speech, and it is not the mandate of ZEC alone. Yes, ZEC is mandated to do that in terms of the Constitution, but we need other stakeholders also to come in and assist ZEC. I think that is all that I had to say, Honourable Chair, in my remarks.